Hello and welcome to the third of the webinars in the lead up to the Georgetown Global Dialogues in Barcelona in early November. I'm joined today by two of our distinguished fellows, Ranjit Hoskote and Mohsin Hamid. And we are going to talk about fraternity and solidarity in the context of obviously the enormous upheavals in the world today, focusing actually on something that Pope Francis said in his 2020 encyclical Fratelli Tutti, where he made a very clear case for human fraternity and even for a much more radical idea of political love. Um, so we're going to be talking for about 45 minutes and then have some questions. Please post your questions in the chat box provided on your screens. I'm going to turn to Mohsin very quickly because he's written an essay which you will see very soon on the Georgetown Global Dialogues website, making a really remarkable case for just how the idea of political love or politics rooted in a radical form of love has become absolutely essential. The idea seems more radical, of course, when you recognize that most of politics today is driven by hatred and organized loathing of minorities, immigrants, of course, helped by digital technologies, by social media, dominated, monopolized by political business entrepreneurs who make money of this organization of hatred and loathing. So, Mohsen, I mean, could you elaborate on this idea and sort of tell us what exactly you mean and why do you think it's such a radical idea and why it is needed at this point?
Sure, Pankaj. And I think at the moment we live in a time of very considerable alienation. And there are multiple reasons for that alienation, but to take two of them, one is the impact that technology is having upon us, that this virtual world that we are encountering, spending so many of our waking hours staring into screens. But beyond that, so many things are now being represented through their screen version. You don't see, your grocery store. You may see just a delivery person, or maybe not even that. You may simply pick up a bag outside of your front door. You don't see your banker. You don't see potentially your teacher. Possibly you don't even see your lover. All of these people may now appear to you through screens. And I think this has a profoundly alienating impact on human beings. The virtual world, the confusion of the the map and the territory has become so profound that we're going through life in what we're being told is a kind of frictionless utopia. But it turns out that the friction was human touch, and that has now been removed. And so we experience profound alienation. And alongside that, we experience a second form of alienation, which is our economic system, which is this profound neoliberal model, which really reduces human beings to economic abstraction. Your value is what you're worth and what you can buy. Anything's value is simply its economic price. This, of course, is a shorthand. It was useful thousands of years ago for Sumerian traders to have some mode of deciding, how you would price a bushel of wheat. But we've taken that now to the point where the notion of, what is the value of a human being and what is human has been so eclipsed. So this is the environment in which we find ourselves, and I think out of that we see all of these horrible manifestations, symptoms that emerge from this disease of alienation. And these are, as what you just mentioned, Pankaj, it is the hatred of the other, it is wars, it is disregarding a carefully assembled law of human rights, disregarding the need of refugees and migrants, disregarding the needs of the poor, of those who have not enough food, um, uh, and and we are able to do this because out of our alienation, we are told, in a sense, to alienate ourselves from everybody else, to deploy, in a way, a kind of hatred, a sort of scream of pain towards the world, and to inflict pain on others. Now, that predicament is something which we've seen addressed in the past. It has come up. And in my essay, I talked about two people who were, in a sense, considered Romans, but weren't from Rome. The first, of course, was, historically speaking, was the poet Jalaluddin, who came to be called Rumi because he settled in Anatolia after the fall of the Eastern Roman Empire, and it was still thought of as Rome. And so they called him Rumi, and Rumi wrote this poetry, which was really incredible. And it was born out of his own experience, fleeing the Mongol invasions of Southwest Asia, where in places like Baghdad, 1 million people were put to death by swords over multiple days because it took that long just to kill that many people. And out of this hugely traumatic experience, Rumi came to understand that there was something in our shared suffering that unites us, and he wrote these love poems that were really based on the notion that we can have a profound sense of empathy through love, for one another. And it is only out of that, establishing a shared sense of the human, a shared sense of a connection, that we can possibly hope to transcend the horrors of his age, and also one might consider this age. And the second person, another Roman, not from Rome, was, of course, Pope Francis, who was from Argentina, who, as a priest, was dedicated both to humility. He would wash the feet of prisoners, of the poor, of the elderly, people that you would want to take your gaze away from. He would look at, and more than look at, he would hold their feet in his hands and he would wash them, which is, of course, a profound act of humility, but also of love. And then once he became Pope, in his encyclical Fratelli Tutti, we are all siblings. He advocated for a kind of political love that really that we refuse to not see the humanity in each other. And I sort of was wanted to just tee up for our conversation these two figures at very different moments in time, with very different associations with Rome, each of whom offered to us the possibility of a radical shift in politics. We might think of these sorts of things, the notion of political love, or Rumi's idea that we are all, the reeds of a flute that sort of call out from the reed beds from which we were cut. It sounds a bit preposterous, in this moment of GDP targeting and mass deportations, and yet it isn't. In a sense, what both Pope Francis and what Rumi are exhorting us is to acknowledge that we have a desire to recognize the humanity in others, and that this innate human desire can be the basis of a politics which is the opposite of dehumanization, but is of humanization. And that from this, something better could come. So I think those are the notions that hopefully we can begin to explore today. What is the origin of these sorts of positions? How might they be of use to us now? And how, despite our initial discomfort, and in fact, maybe even dismissal of the notion of love, it is perhaps the most profound and true mechanism that we have, from which to build a resistance to the politics, the depraved politics that we see around us.
Thank you, Mohsen. As you were speaking, and of these two distinguished Romans, it occurred to me that, of course, the major challenge to Roman imperialism or Roman Empire came from a belief system, an ethical system that prioritized love against brutal imperialism, brutal exploitation, or systematic oppression. And it seems to me a great historical irony that here we are in 2025, still invoking that wisdom against the brutal imperialisms of our own time, which also makes us look quite resourceless or defenseless in one sense, but also alerts us to this immense philosophical, spiritual wealth stored up in the past that we don't often invoke as much as we should, which is always there available to us. And there are, personalities, figures like Pope Francis who can, reach into it, deep into it, because they're so intimately um, aware of it, and bring it forward. But I think for the most part, you don't hear that kind of discourse or conversation with the same emphasis on the virtues or the values of love and compassion and so much secular discourse. But anyway, I will turn to, thank you, Merson, for this intervention. I'll turn to Ranjit now and ask him perhaps why he thinks there has been this extraordinary um, intellectual come sort of moral vacuum at the heart of so much political discourse, that it can't conceive of fraternity or solidarity except in the narrowest of terms, like solidarity defined really through reference to ethno-national or racial religious community, and nothing more. It's worth examining why this is so, especially when those modes of solidarity are dominant right now.
Yeah, thank you very much, Pankaj. And Mohsen, thank you for that beautiful exposition. And as you were speaking, it occurred to me that one of our key problems, I think, in the way in which we think about politics is that we want politics to be the ground of reason, which we construe rather narrowly, to be a way of allocating value, asserting rights, managing interests, and so on. And the minute we talk about love or compassion, all this is suddenly seen to be vague, sentimental, and yet what we need perhaps more than ever before is, in fact, an education in the sentiments. And it's strange that even while we think about love, compassion, forgiveness, atonement, and all of these rather positive and redemptive things, we think of all these as vague. But the politics of today is largely built on something equally affective and emotional and unreasonable. It's hatred. And I just can't help thinking, particularly in these last weeks, I'm drawn back to a book Saskia Sassen wrote over a decade ago. And it strikes me that more than ever before, this is an age of expulsions. We are building our notion of a just society on the basis of love for those like ourselves and nothing but hatred, unabated hatred for anyone who's different. And we are rebuilding our notions of justice in various societies across the world to conform to this very, very dangerous and damaging asymmetry. So we're living through a moment when our very notion of justice is being shaken, so much for the notion of what is the rational high ground we're thinking about. And I can't help thinking that part of the problem lies not only with politics we regard as extremist. What we've cherished as a centrist politics has these problems already because it's based on agonism. I'm thinking here now of Chantal Mouffe's idea of how politics as a practice, as a collective practice, is really an exercise in agonism, in rivalry, in managing the distinction between friends and enemies. And I think that in a world like ours, which you so beautifully characterized just now, Mohsin, where we're all descending into our virtual solitudes, we are more atomized than ever. We're more vulnerable than ever to claims to solidarity that speak to what is worst within us. And within that, what can a politics of agonism mean? Wherever you look, agonism is now just spilling over into antagonism and into annihilation. And I think we really need to question our notion of what democracy can mean, what a just and viable political system can mean. Is it about managing competing interests? Is it about rivalry? Is it about agonism at all? Or should we switch fairly radically to thinking about the primal situation of being in the presence of the other in terms of what Levinas would have described as responding to the vulnerability of the other? I mean, we're being trained, conditioned, and educated now to see the other as basically the enemy. What if you embrace the risk of the other as vulnerable? And I think that this might be a way of thinking about what we're calling love here. What does it mean to reach out beyond what you are familiar with and which you regard as your own, and to seek common ground with something that's dissimilar, which may seem threatening, which is other, and which requires translation? I think these are new competences that we are going to need in politics. Responsiveness, an ability to think about listening as a mode of transformation, ability to translate ourselves to others and to see them through translation. I think all of this is it's going to be part of what you might call our skill set if we have to survive this bleak and dire time. And as I speak, I'm thinking of a very, very different way of thinking about the relationship between the self and the other, which comes out of Buddhist tradition, where there's a Buddhist text which talks about the Brahma Viharas, which sometimes are translated as the abode of godliness, which is more theological than Buddhism would allow for. I think a good way of thinking about the Brahma Viharas would be to see them as spaces of commonality, spaces of solidarity. And there is a Buddhist exercise in which you extend yourself through 4 steps to the world, through Maitri, which is literally, it's translated as loving kindness, but it literally means friendship. Karuna, which is compassion. Mudita, which is the ability to take joy in the joy of others, which is an underrated art. And finally, upeksha, which is equanimity, which is the ability not to be shaken, to fly into tempestuous responses to what the world is hurling at you. And it strikes me that this notion of the Brahma Viharas was developed in the northwest of the Indian subcontinent at a time when there were invasions, when there were massacres, when there was a great convergence and coming together of very, very dissimilar people from Greece, from Persia, from China, from northern India, from further south. So it's not as if this notion of releasing oneself through these positive aspects of friendship and compassion and so on was happening in a vacuum. It actually was an ethical experiment at a time of great moral challenges that were being hurled at the people thinking these ways of being through. So I would put some of these ideas in play, and I think that they sit alongside what Pope Francis was thinking about in terms of political love. Might we parse that as a politics of love? Could we see that as not a contradiction in terms? And could we place that alongside also of Rumi's idea, which in many ways his practice of love is something that is not even really ultimately based on reciprocity. It's an ability to embrace a risk, not with a notion of reward or acceptance, but simply because that is the gift one offers to the world.
Thank you, Ranjit. I was just thinking as you were mentioning the sort of Buddhist tradition, also it's kind of it's in some sense it's practical application. Just some small question: do you think Gandhi came closest in his political practice
Very
to
much so.
realizing some of these ideas about fraternity, solidarity, love for the other? I mean, especially his work on Hindu-Muslim relations,
Yes.
and especially towards the end of his life in a very dark moment. Could you say something about that? Because I think sometimes I feel like these historical episodes need to be highlighted a bit more. We've spent decades now without the kind of examples that we really need at this moment.
Absolutely. To me, it's actually Gandhi's last few months that shine out of all of the darkness of the partition. I mean, we tend to remember the independence, the moment of independence as liberation, emancipation from British colonial rule, but it came at an immense cost, which was the partition of the subcontinent, horrific and unbelievable violence, the splintering of a society that had been held together by various mechanisms, I would say also organisms of fraternity, of solidarity. And in that moment, Gandhi, instead of celebrating independence formally in Delhi, the new capital, is actually thousands of miles away in Noakhali, in eastern Bengal, where the violence of the partition has erupted. Its communities have been destroyed. And he chooses to go there and spend time in a dialogue, seeking healing, seeking to bring people together across the new gulf of hatred, and placing himself at risk. I mean, this is not someone who was simply issuing philosophical manifestos from safety. He put himself in a very bodied way into the path of catastrophe and devoted himself to the task of healing. And again, that was a risk. I think that expression of love and the hope that love would prevail over fratricidal hatred, that was a risk. And eventually, of course, he did pay with his life for it, which was his trajectory eventually. But I'm just thinking that even in a more modest way, I think this is the challenge before many of us today, as we now figure out how to craft our lives at a time when hatred is the norm, and expulsion is a reality, and fratricide is really is the rule of the day.
Thank you, Ranjit. Mohsin, I mean, I was wondering when you were speaking earlier, in fact, especially when you spoke about technology and its enticements, the way it sort of weaves a spell and sort of makes people, in a way, both extremely alienated and sort of isolated, but also gives them a false sense of empowerment. And I was wondering whether, there has been in so much of contemporary culture an emphasis on individual empowerment. And I think that is connected very closely to the pursuit of a certain kind of secular power, of material power, whether it's economic power or social capital. In this process, and we've all kind of embraced it. So, like everyone talks about empowerment, like let's empower this, let's empower that. We've perhaps forgotten that not all power is for the good, or certainly it can be wielded in all kinds of horrific ways. So we've come to have a neutral attitude towards power, whereas all these people that we've discussed right now, whether it's Rumi or Gandhi or Pope Francis, washing the feet of prisoners or sort of asylum seekers, we see an opposite impulse. We see an impulse to renounce power, to renounce status. And I just wondered if you have any, thoughts about that. I'm just sort of struck by this huge discrepancy between these older ideals and the ideals that we've kind of upheld over several decades now, globally.
I think that this notion of renunciation, at least of certain types of power or certain types of status, has been with us for a very long time, and it is the very sort of antithesis of what modern society is built on. The more followers, the more likes, the more pays per view, the more whatever, the more successful your organism or your economic being is. Except that we find that this makes us utterly miserable. So, all over the world, but particularly in societies where you see, in a sense, the most empowered people, people are not having children. People are complaining of being unable to have, meaningful relationships. Friendships are waning. You see, in a sense, nearly societal collapse, where some countries are likely to be half or a quarter of the population of today in a century's time. And now, on the one hand, leaving aside the question of are there too many human beings on the planet, I think there is this notion that we are not particularly thriving in our supposedly empowered state. And so that leads, I guess, to two, I suppose, observations. One is the economic model we have, and so much of the philosophical underpinnings of our current economy and our current notion of empowerment, comes to us from the Enlightenment. And the Enlightenment comes to us from a particular moment of science, where it was possible to conceive of the universe as something, something that followed, in a sense, complicated but eminently understandable mathematical formulae. And the human being in this context was sort of like a god who could sort of understand all this stuff and then say, well, this is how, this is how the galaxy works, this is how the earth works, et cetera, et cetera. And from this privileged position, with no renunciation of ego, could sort of say, we don't need anything else, we get it all, let's move forward and build our paradise here. That model is coming under strain, partly because so many of us are so unhappy and because of this, the wheels are coming off the project, I think, in many ways. But it is scientifically no longer supported. In other words, this notion of a universe that follows, fairly, of course, complicated, but easily understandable rules is vanishing the closer we look at it. We think of quantum theory, we think of, the atom is no longer actually this little miniature star system with a sun-like, center surrounded by these, planet-like electrons. It's infinitely more complex than that. The very notion of time bending and what time is, as we come to understand our universe more, we find ourselves in a position of enormously more humility than we occupied at the time that Enlightenment philosophy was built. And I think this position where science itself is forcing us into humility then gives rise to, in a sense, the notion of a desire for alternate ways of finding meaning. And, having cut ourselves off from love, from spirituality, from renunciation, from, shared human sentiment, we are sort of grasping ignorantly towards these hatreds and towards these false, notions. We know we won't live forever, but we act like we do. We know that the universe is not the way our representation of it tells us it is, and yet we act like it is. We have shrouded ourselves in willful ignorance because we are unable, in a way, at the moment, to really comprehend the awe of what the universe actually is. And so, in a way, it's a very fertile moment. It's a very fertile moment for a radical rethinking of what our politics should be like, of what our relationship to science should be like, of what our economy should be like. Because we know now, in a sense, that reason is no longer on the side of the model that we have built. The model that we have built was built upon fictitious oversimplifications that do not hold. And so we need to experience uncertainty, we need to experience smallness, we need to experience, the challenging of what it is to be human in a way that perhaps our ancestors had to experience. And they crafted, very complicated modes of dealing with this. And we are now called upon to do so once again. And so as we do that, it's worth asking ourselves, what did they do? And so many of the questions that we're talking about today in an older era would be called spiritual questions. And we need to find ways to talk about these things that are not limited to people of a particular spiritual tradition, but are open to everyone. And the search for that language, I think, is what we're talking about here. And in our search for that language, this notion of love, and we can say more about what we mean by it, is very, very central, because it is the underpinning, I think, of so much of spiritual impulse and also spiritual tradition. And so as we begin to excavate the meaning of that, we need to also excavate the meaning of what they meant by love and what we might mean by love. And that's where people, I think, like Pope Francis and Rumi begin to point us in a very interesting direction.
Well, this is really certainly music to my ears, because I think, so much of the global dialogues is, or the idea behind it is, as you know, Mohsin, um, sort of derived from the realization that we are now in this moment of, unprecedented realizations. One of those is that we are far weaker, far more fallible than we thought we were when this whole project of secular modernity began, with this idea of the individual being the master of not only his or her destiny, but indeed able to shape the world using these laws of science, using these, then recently acquired scientific knowledge. But as you say, 200 years later, we find ourselves pretty helpless before this, vast, incomprehensible spectacle, which grows bigger and bigger and more baffling all the time. And we are no wiser, certainly, in our political arrangements or economic arrangements. So I think it's sort of, again, opens up that question of like, what is the what is the what is the sort of fundamental basis or agreed upon idea about human beings, on which we construct a new way of thinking about this. And it seems to me what you're proposing is an idea of love based on a mutual recognition of weakness and vulnerability, and a sort of recognition that we are all actually now in this thing together, where we are confronting a universe which we thought we could master, a world we thought we could master, but we can't. It's spinning out of our control here. And what really needs to happen is for people to create new bonds of community. Individualism, which was also the big sort of wager of the Enlightenment, the idea of the individual human being with his faculties of reason and science being able to conceive of new ways of emancipation. I think all of that we are realizing was a kind of attractive fantasy. It hasn't quite worked out in the way people thought it would. And individualism has proved to be a great deception, in the sense that people find themselves more enslaved to technology than ever before, less free in many ways than our ancestors would have been. But anyway, so I just wanted, Ranjit, if you have any reflections on what Mohsin just said.
Of course, a couple of things that I'd maybe put in play following from our revisiting of the Enlightenment. Of course, there was this belief in reason, in the scientific temper, in the ability to see the universe as a kind of a clockwork, however complex, but a clockwork mechanism that could be decoded. But I think the big difference between Renaissance humanism and the humanism of the Enlightenment was that, for what it's worth, Renaissance humanism still saw the human being as part of a larger set of relationships with other beings in nature, even if that relationship was a relationship of the mastery of the human over other species. I think what happened with the Enlightenment was that connection was radically ruptured. There was really now the sense that, thanks to science and reason and all of this, there was a rise of what you might want to call expert culture, and the sense that the sovereign human individual would then see all of nature as resources to be exploited. This is the language that's still so commonly used. People don't realize that when they say they want to exploit nature, the language carries within it the impulses of colonialism and empire, which brings me to the other aspects of the Enlightenment, which is that it was built on an understanding that the sacraments of the church, of feudal society, were to be left in the past, and what would now take its place was the contract. So there was a sanctity of the contract between individuals. It was a contractarian understanding, which may have held, which has a lot of legal meaning and has implications for the rule of law and so forth. But it also tends to diminish what it is that we bring to our human relationships in terms of being in a certain contract, a set of agreements which are binding for certain reasons, for reasons of external authority. But what is it innately that connects us to other people? I think that question cannot be resolved by a contractarian way of looking at relationships. And of course, the other aspect of this is that the contract is linked to property. So you have the Enlightenment enshrining the rights of the individual. The sanctity of the contract is creating, articulating, and upholding relations between individuals. And finally, the notion of property as somehow legitimizing the individual's place in the world and your right to secure that property. If you take all of these aspects together, you suddenly realize why it is that we tend to think of nature, of the world at large, of the lives and life worlds of other species as really our property somehow. I live in Bombay. It's a coastal city. It was really 7 islands, which in a first century Greek atlas is called Heptanesia, the 7 islands. But today the islands have vanished because we've built the city up through what we're happy to call a reclamation. And I've always thought about the etymology of this term and its politics. The notion is that all of this land, this territory that is thoughtlessly underwater is really ours, and we have to claim it back, you know. So we've built all kinds of things to take land back from the sea. If we stop for a minute, we actually have no authority and no right whatever to that. It's part of a much larger ecosystem. It's part of the environment, and by reclaiming it and producing space for the plan, what we've actually done is to ruin the natural environment that sustains us. So I would just offer this notion of reclamation as an example of why we've come to where we are through the mechanisms, through the rationalizations, and through the logic of the Enlightenment. So a critique of this moment that we are in would also have to look carefully at all of these things. How do we constitute ourselves as separate from our fellow tenants of the universe, of the world, in any case, of the planet? How do we reconfigure the commitments by which we bind ourselves to one another? And what do we see to be an equitable and just notion of belonging rather than ownership?
Yeah. Well, I mean, I think it's clear that, all these challenges that we face today, whether it's, climate change, inequality, far-right upsurges everywhere, artificial intelligence, obviously, we'll need new institutions, political institutions, economic institutions, which can, coordinate across national boundaries, both economic and political coordination. But what's becoming very clear, and especially after the last 30, 35 minutes, is that we need a profound change in the way people perceive the meaning and overall setting of their lives. So much broader kind of thinking and deeper thinking, and a deeper moral and sort of spiritual transformation is the sort of weight we must all now carry, where the individual self and its relationship with others and to the natural world, all of that has to be reconfigured, which is an immensely tall order. But if you don't rise to that challenge, I think we'll only be making very cosmetic changes to our political and economic institutions. We have a couple of interesting, challenging questions. One of which is, basically it's saying, isn't the basic problem in our world today inequality? Isn't it driving the anger and the hostility? In other words, don't we need a material solution, a more fair distribution of wealth to what looks on the surface to be a moral and spiritual problem? Mohsin, do you want to take that?
Sure, I think it's an excellent question. Now, let's say that we are agreed that we need a less unequal distribution of resources in the world. The question then becomes, how do we get there? And there seem to be, two modes. One is we fight, and those who have less succeed in defeating those who have more, or scaring them enough to get more. And we may very well see many of these sorts of wars in the years to come. We've seen them in the years past. We see them ongoing right now. We see them in civil disturbance and unrest. And one of the ways in which our species has reacted to these great inequalities is through people rising up and fighting. The other approach, of course, is we somehow make it possible for people to believe that relinquishing something they have is something that they wish to do. Now, that is a question not of raw power. That is a question of understanding, of compassion, possibly of love. If we imagine, South Africa's transition from a radically unequal society is tragically very incomplete at this stage. But certainly progress was made in transitioning from apartheid to a post-apartheid South Africa, even if economic inequality in South Africa remains extreme. Now, that progress could have taken the form of a huge and very bloody civil war, or it could have taken the form that it did take, which was a much less bloody transformation of perspectives. Similarly, the end of the British colonial experience in India could have taken a very different form from what it did. We have only to look at Vietnam, for example, where multiple powers were engaged over many decades in a war that sort of devastated the place before Vietnam became a sort of unified, truly independent state. Now, I think what is interesting is to explore that second mode. How do we change perspectives in such a way that this inequality can be lessened without the wars? Knowing that, of course, the wars will come, and that some might even argue the wars are necessary. But I don't think that I'm much needed. People have plenty of reason to go to war without me providing further explanations, and I think we're seeing those justifications growing up all around us. But for those of us who are writers, who are thinkers, who are engaged in these sorts of issues, it's the real question of how do we try to unlock perspectives such that this material change can happen with as little bloodshed as possible. And there, I think, to an earlier point that both you and Ranjit raised, so much of the Enlightenment, both its science and its philosophy and its political economy, is rooted in this notion of the self. It is a very self-centric mode of thinking. Now, it has taken us to the point where we say that corporations are people and they have legal rights, et cetera, et cetera. But we also know that obviously corporations are not people, that they are fictions, as Rajit said, and that when we endow them with certain powers like people, we are taking those powers from somebody else, and that somebody else is actual people. So I think this Enlightenment system that we are looking at right now was built upon the centering of the self. It is becoming untenable and yet we are trying to maintain the center, the self as our center. And I think that's where we get into very interesting territory, because we know now that, the majority, that the human body is made up very substantially of non-human, microscopic life forms, which do everything from, process our food and create the chemicals we need to survive. And if we were to eliminate those non-human dwellers in the apartment building body of every human being, we would be dead very quickly. We also understand that the mode in which we interact with the world, and we often retrofit volitional choice onto decisions that were done by reptilian parts of the brain. And we can see that we've done something for a reason that is below the level of word-based thought. And then we've crafted a story to sit on top of it. We know that time bends. We know that the physical universe is not what we think it is. We know that, the quantum universe is almost too difficult to even imagine. So the self is becoming profoundly destabilized. And yet we are clinging to this fiction of an enlightenment self. And it is forcing us into ever greater contortions about corporations being people, contortions about human beings, being the self at the center of it. And what I think this notion of love begins to do is, in a potentially less frightening way, open up the possibility of destabilizing the centricity of the self. That love allows us to feel something for somebody else who is not ourself. And we can allow ourselves to believe that that feeling has value. And if that feeling has value, then our commitment to ourself as the be-all, end-all can diminish. And if that can diminish, we perhaps open up a political and spiritual space that does allow for us to see a material change in resources without the bloodshed that is often involved. So I think that's how I would approach that particular question.
Ranjit?
I want to add to what Mohsen said about this destabilized self and the fact that this brings us anxiety and anguish. On the other hand, if we decide, we recognize that we've invested so much in this notion of individuality as a citadel to be defended. If we see ourselves as individuals, if we move our emphasis from the notion of the individual to the notion of the dividual, we would then really be able to release ourselves towards the other sentient beings, the other things, and the other situations towards which we have commitments, which make claims on us, and in terms of which we evolve, really. So I think it calls for, exactly as you said, Mohsen, I think it calls for a switch. If we see ourselves really as bearers of individuality, we would really be much more responsive to many of these questions, because we would also see that we share predicaments, that we are not the only ones who are in a precarious situation. We are not the only ones who are, put upon by this world and in a relationship of continuous competition and antagonism with it. And this, I think, would be one of the best ways in which to seek this common ground and to recognize that we really evolve through our relationships, through dialogues. And there really is no need to try and preserve this exceptionalist individual self. We actually are, we fashion ourselves. And I think placing our faith and our trust in this kind of process of self-fashioning through being with others, I think that's a crucial mental switch that we need to make.
Thank you, Ranjit. Thank you also, Mohsen. There's a related question, which is also a challenging one, like how do we reconfigure a culture? Isn't that what the discussion is about? Can art and literature help in the transformation? And if so, how? Just thinking about this, thinking, when we speak of art and literature, we think of it as something confined to a particular elite, an economic elite, a social elite in any society. So if we were to place the burden only on art and literature for that reconfiguration of culture, then we're looking at, change happening in a powerful minority, within a powerful minority, but nevertheless change that is limited. But there are other ways, perhaps. Mohsen, I'd love to hear, because, I think you've written about music being this thing, which we don't really think about when we think about, art or literature, but it is that thing which decenters the self, reconfigures our sense of ourselves, in a very profound way. I mean, obviously there have to be other mechanisms, whether it's political movements or other ways of people coming together that help reconfigure a culture. But anyway, yeah, I'd love to know what you think of this question, Mohsen.
I think that what the arts generally, collectively uh, uh, do is they allow us access to places where it is possible to relinquish our attachment to the self. Um, and that can happen in different ways. Being transported by a piece of music, or by Rumi's poem, or by a beautiful painting. We think of art and literature perhaps in an elitist context because we exist in an economically elitist system. But of course, we know that literature and music and visual art is very alive at the level of the smallest tribal community. We have taken our art into our political economy, and so we look at it as suspect, and it may well be suspect. But what underlies it, I think, is not necessarily suspect. This notion that when you read a book, you are not you're not yourself, or listen to a story around a fire. You have someone else's words inside you, and yet you're not that person. But their words are inside you, and they're causing you to imagine into being something else. And you are a sort of dual being at that moment, both the person who's sort of imagining the story into existence, but also the recipient of these words, but also the creator of something. You aren't yourself, you're not the other person. What are you? And when you listen to transformative music, it's exactly the same thing. What is that thing that you feel? What is happening to you? Why in so many cultures do we have music as a part of their spiritual and cultural practices? Because of this possibility. I think that the arts allow us access to this place where the self can be destabilized. They are often a kind of ritual that we engage in to enter into a destabilized self. And so, when we think of this cultural transformation, which is where the question began, I think the arts are very much part of it. But it may be that the arts we're speaking of don't have to be, the best-selling book, the Grammy-winning song, the prize-winning painting. But rather something happening in a very different scale, in a complete multiplicity, in very different ways, and affecting and opening up people. Which doesn't mean that there can't be works of art that are mass transmitted and achieve enormous impact. But we shouldn't limit ourselves to just thinking about art that way. Nor should we limit ourselves to thinking of the person engaging with the art as the consumer of the art. If we allow ourselves to think of the person who views the painting, who reads the book, who listens to the song, as a creator themselves, invited into a state of co-creation by the presence of that art, as opposed to the consumer of what some other producer is selling, we then realize that it codifies our existing inequalities, but we invite one another into mutually creative positions. And that art, in a sense, is an open door to accepting the artist, in a sense, within each of us. And it is that artist within us that allows us to begin to paint our way, or sing our way, or tell a story of our way out of the self, which we all need to do. Just to close this thought off, we are all going to die. And before we get there, we require modes of dealing with that predicament. And I think understanding that art allows us to be artists, allows us to create, is essential to this culture, because the alternative a sort of death-denying culture becomes also a death-obsessing and death-dealing culture. And so we are talking about really a very profound spiritual crisis, to which I think art and the notion of art unlocking the artist, inside the person and freeing them from the self, which is a kind of fiction, is very potent.
Ranjit, do you have any?
Yes, actually, I completely agree with you, Mohsin. Also, because I have a life in the visual arts, and this question is often posed to me because the one lens through which people look at art today is its price, the value, the auction houses, the galleries, and there's this constant question about if all of these paintings or sculptures or video works are priced as they are, how can they possibly have larger relevance to anyone? To this, I always say there might be one collector or one institution that acquires a work, but nothing stops all the rest of us from carrying the work away in our minds, in our heads, in our imagination. And I think that that is what truly makes for the experience of art. I think if we shift our attention from the art object to the art experience, exactly as you said, Mohsin, it becomes a space of transformation. And in a very exact, literal sense, it's a space of ecstasy. Because ecstasy, as you know from the Greek, is ekstasis. It's the experience of standing outside of yourself. Any work of art, whether it's a narrative, a literary narrative, a book, a painting, a film, a piece of theater, music, all of these invite us to stand outside of ourselves. And in that sense, I think art has that ecstatic potential, which then invites us to give up our comfort zone, our cultural assumptions, our political attitudes. We stand outside of ourselves, we see the world anew, and we really are able to fashion ourselves differently. So I think that is the promise and the potential of art, and which is why it's to be cherished. There's a radical politics to the art experience at its best and its transformative possibilities.
We have time for one more question. I think this is an interesting one. Are there any positive examples of spirituality and love at the global level? I can think of Gandhi or Martin Luther King, but they operated in national contexts. I don't know whether national context would be the right way to describe the very long and multi-destination journeys of people like Martin Luther King and uh, and Gandhi. But Ranjit, do you want to have a crack at this?
Frankly, I'm thinking of the long and living tradition of Buddhist practice and the way it's unfolded across countries and continents, across national contexts, really, as holding out a possibility of how to assemble, how to create communities of compassion, how to develop more attentive and responsive and responsible lives. And like every other organized religion, Buddhism, especially in its tense relationship to political establishments, of course, has a sinister and dangerous side, as we've seen in Sri Lanka, for instance, or in Burma. But on the other hand, there always has been a way in which Buddhist practice allows for movements of resilience and resistance and questioning to emerge. So I would still place some faith in that. Also, as you said, the way in which Gandhi's thought and practice or Martin Luther King's thought and practice have traveled, sometimes these ideas find unexpected recipients and they develop a new life or afterlife somewhere else. I think, for instance, of how the Dalit movements in India have drawn on work that came out in the first place of African American culture and politics and an experience from the south of the US. You might think this was a very American theme, but it lives and resonates and has offered redemptive energy to the vulnerable and the suffering in central India, for instance. Yeah.
Or for that matter, Martin Luther King being inspired as a Christian by Gandhi.
Exactly.
Or Reinhold Niebuhr. I mean, there are many
Yeah.
examples. And actually, what's interesting, there's one of the questions here, which is a question we often face whenever we talk about religion and spirituality, because religion has been misused so badly over the centuries in support of hatred and violence that it's lost its credibility. And I think there's always a danger when speaking of religion is not thinking of it in the ways we just been discussing. Someone like Gandhi, who's not actually formally a Christian, doesn't claim to be a Christian, is not part of the church, and yet embraces certain, spiritual values, ethical values that other Christians around the world can respond to. Likewise, we can say of many such people. Rumi or Pope Francis, that they belong to very clearly defined religious traditions, but what they say travels across these national boundaries and national contexts. But thank you so much. We've run out of time, unfortunately, so not enough time for all the other interesting questions. But thank you all for joining us, and those of you who can make it, welcome to the next Georgetown Global Dialogues in Barcelona. Hope to see you all there.